Okay, so you guys sent us some really interesting stuff, and I think we're ready to kind of jump right into it.
Yeah,
Michael, you've been looking at excerpts from We Never Die and kind of diving into the ideas of Christopher Langan
right.
and his cognitive theoretic model of the universe,
Yeah, that's right.
CTMU.
And I think what's really striking about this material is how ambitious it is.
Yeah.
He isn't just sort of like tinkering around the edges of trying to figure things out.
Right.
He's really trying to provide a fundamental framework for everything.
Yeah.
So our goal today is to really extract the core of his thinking
Right.
on some of the biggest questions that you've posed to us.
Yeah.
The nature of reality,
Right.
consciousness,
Yeah.
God, what happens after we die,
Right.
and even the roots of good and evil,
Yeah.
all based directly on the insights in the text that you shared.
Right. And for those who might not be familiar with Langan, he's, I think, recognized for having an exceptionally high IQ. And the CTMU is kind of his attempt to have like a single unified theory of everything.
That's right. It's
So,
theory of everything.
yeah. So prepare for some pretty revolutionary concepts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So let's dive straight in then. What does Langan have to say about the nature of reality itself
Yeah.
and the existence of God?
Well, he doesn't mince words.
Yeah.
His core insight right from the start is direct. God exists.
Okay.
Simple as that.
Right.
But what follows is this fascinating unpacking of what that statement means.
Yeah.
He argues that when we talk about reality, we're naming something
Mm-hmm.
that has an inherent identity.
Right.
Think of it like this. When you point to a chair and say chair,
Right.
that word is identifying a specific thing.
Right.
Langan argues that reality functions similarly.
Okay.
It's a name for a fundamental identity.
Okay.
And the CTMU, in part, is his attempt to describe the underlying structure
Okay.
of this identity.
So the very act of us perceiving and naming reality implies something fundamental underneath. That's an interesting starting point.
Yeah.
Where does God fit into this identity of reality?
So this work is really compelling.
Okay.
Langan examines the properties we often associate with this identity of reality.
Okay.
Its completeness,
Yeah.
its encompassing nature.
Right.
And he finds striking parallels with the characteristics attributed to God in major religions.
Okay.
We're talking about what are traditionally called omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotence,
Yeah.
all-powerful,
Mhm.
and omnipresence,
Yeah.
present everywhere.
Right.
It's not just a list of traits, though.
Yeah.
Langan sees these as inherent aspects
Right.
of this fundamental identity that we call reality.
So these aren't just human concepts projected onto the universe,
Right.
but rather fundamental properties of what reality is.
Exactly.
Okay.
And what's fascinating is that Langan isn't approaching this through traditional faith or dogma.
Right.
He's building a structural argument.
Yep.
He emphasizes that this God isn't some distant, abstract concept,
Yeah.
but fundamentally conscious,
Right.
sentient,
Yeah.
and therefore personal.
Yeah.
The text even suggests that a personal relationship with this God
Mhm.
isn't just a possibility,
Mm.
it's almost a natural consequence of this inherent connection.
This idea of humans being images of God, it is something that comes up a lot in different traditions. How does Langan interpret that?
He explains it as God essentially mapping himself into each human being.
Okay.
Think of it like a blueprint or a reflection,
Right.
but not a perfect copy.
Yeah.
It implies a fundamental connection, a
Right.
shared essence.
Yeah.
Now, it's crucial to clarify, as Langan himself does,
Okay.
that this isn't pantheism,
Yeah.
the idea that God is the universe,
Right.
that everything we see is God in a direct, unfiltered way.
Right.
Instead, his view aligns with panentheism.
Okay. Unpack that difference for us, pantheism versus panentheism.
Right.
What's the key distinction there for you, Michael?
Think of it this way.
Oh,
For
boy.
panentheism, the artist is the painting.
Right.
There's no separation.
Yeah.
With panentheism, the painting is within the artist,
Okay.
a creation of the artist,
Right.
infused with their being.
Mm-hmm.
But the artist is far greater and not limited to that single work.
Right.
That's how Langan sees the relationship between God and the universe.
Okay.
God is the ultimate reality,
Yeah.
encompassing and permeating the universe,
Right.
but not confined to it.
Okay.
The universe exhibits these godlike qualities,
Yeah.
complete knowledge,
Right.
ultimate power,
Mm.
omnipresence,
Yeah.
because it is fundamentally connected to and derived from
Okay.
this divine identity.
Yeah.
And Langan argues that this God is consciously aware,
Right.
actively forging connections with us,
Right.
by embedding a part of himself, a
Right.
spark of consciousness
Mm.
within each person.
So it's not just about a belief in something out there.
Right.
It's about an inherent link, a piece of that fundamental identity residing within us.
Yeah.
And the text goes on to suggest that this God isn't just a philosophical construct,
Right.
but is actually necessary for reality to function correctly.
Yeah.
How
He-
so?
Langen posits that the very mathematical and logical structure underlying reality
Right.
demands a central, conscious, and
Right.
self-aware foundation.
Okay.
Without this ultimate identity operator, as he terms it later,
Right.
reality as we experience it
Yeah.
with its inherent order
Yeah.
and dynamism wouldn't
Right.
be possible.
Okay.
This naturally leads us to consider
Yeah.
how this perspective meshes with other contemporary ideas about the nature of reality,
Yeah.
particularly the simulation hypothesis.
The simulation hypothesis, the notion that our entire reality might be a meticulously crafted computer program.
Right.
It's a concept that's really captured the popular imagination. So
Absolutely.
how does Langen's CTMU engage with this idea?
Langen, as you read in the text,
Yeah.
actually finds the simulation hypothesis quite plausible. He suggests that what we perceive as our physical reality
Right.
could very well be the display of a simulation,
Right.
the static states, the
Right.
objects,
Yeah.
the visual and sensory information we experience.
Right. Like in a video game, you have the graphics,
Right.
but behind the scenes, there's the code, the central processor making everything happen according to certain rules.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Langen proposes that God encompasses both of these aspects.
Right.
The display,
Right.
the static states of our universe,
Okay.
and the processor,
Yeah.
the fundamental force that governs their interactions and evolution.
Right.
He uses the analogy of calculus with its infinitesimal intervals
Okay.
to represent this continuous processing
Right.
that isn't contained within the discrete static states themselves.
Okay.
So in this view, God provides the fundamental computational power,
Right.
the underlying logic
Mm-hmm.
for the universe to operate.
So God isn't just the programmer running the simulation.
Right.
God is the entire system, both the software and the hardware,
Yeah.
the rules and the engine that executes them.
Exactly.
That's a powerful reinterpretation of that simulation idea.
Yeah.
Now let's shift our focus to something that's deeply personal to each of us,
Okay.
consciousness.
Right.
How does Langen's CTMU explain what it means to be aware?
This is where Langen delves into the concepts of quantization
Okay.
and what he calls identity operators.
All right.
To grasp the underlying theory,
Yeah.
he argues we need to identify the most fundamental, irreducible units of reality,
Okay.
the quanta.
Right.
In his framework, a key quantum is the identity operator.
Okay.
And here's a pivotal point.
Yeah.
Langen posits that God is the ultimate identity operator.
Okay, so break down this idea of an identity operator for us.
Right.
What does it fundamentally do?
As described in the text,
Yeah.
an identity operator takes input from its environment,
Okay.
recognizes or accepts it based on its internal syntax or rules,
Right.
processes that input, and then returns a modified state back to the external world.
Okay.
Now, Langen extends this fundamental model to all levels of reality
Okay.
in a truly mind-bending assertion.
Yeah.
He even suggests that something as seemingly inert as a table
Right.
possesses a form of generic consciousness
Okay.
because its very existence and definition are reliant on our consciousness
Okay.
to perceive and interact.
Even a table.
Yeah.
That's a pretty radical idea. It makes you rethink what consciousness even means.
It does.
Yeah.
The text explains that there are different levels of these quanta,
Okay.
with what he calls tertiary quanta,
Yeah.
being the building blocks of the physical world,
Okay.
assembled through fundamental forces.
Mm.
However, crucially, these forces are underdetermined at the quantum level,
Right.
which connects to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle.
Okay.
The principle that at the quantum level, there are inherent limits to how precisely we can know
Right.
certain pairs of properties of a particle. Langen argues that consciousness operates through this hierarchical system of identity operators at various levels of complexity.
Right.
Therefore, everything possesses some degree of awareness,
Okay.
though human consciousness represents a far more intricate and self-reflective form.
Yeah.
And importantly, Langen emphasizes that consciousness isn't just a passive observer of reality.
Right.
It actively participates in shaping how reality manifests.
So our awareness isn't just a side effect of complex biological processes.
Yes.
It's an active player in the unfolding of the cosmos.
Right.
That's a pretty profound shift in perspective.
Yeah.
This naturally leads us to the question of free will.
Okay.
If reality has this inherent probabilistic element at the quantum level,
Right.
and if our consciousness is actively involved,
Yeah.
what does that imply about our ability to make genuine choices?
The text directly tackles this question.
Okay.
Langen connects the probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics
Right.
to the very possibility of free will. He argues that reality isn't a fixed, predetermined sequence of events.
Okay.
Instead, it's fundamentally generative,
Right.
constantly being created and recreated
Yeah.
at the most fundamental levels.
So the universe isn't just playing out a pre-written script.
Precisely.
Okay.
And our active observation plays a critical role
Right.
in this ongoing creative process.
Yeah.
When we observe something,
Mm-hmm.
for instance, you perceiving the sound of my voice right now,
Yeah.
the text explains that we are actively participating in defining reality
Okay.
by recognizing boundaries,
Okay.
by distinguishing one thing from another.
Yeah.
Langen uses the example of a baby learning to differentiate objects,
Okay.
establishing boundaries
Yeah.
as a fundamental act of participating in this creative process.
Okay.
Therefore, according to his framework,
Yeah.
we possess genuine free will
Right.
because reality itself is inherently open-ended and generative, not fixed.
That's an empowering thought, Michael.
Yeah.
Our choices aren't just illusions. They're part of the ongoing creation of reality itself.
Absolutely.
Now, let's turn to a topic that has captivated human thought for millennia.
Right.
What happens after we die?
Right.
The text you provided touches on the afterlife,
Yeah.
and it presents a picture that's perhaps less traditional than some might expect.
That's right.
Okay.
Langen asserts quite clearly that persistence after death is a reality.
Okay.
You will persist after you die.
Okay.
However, the destination isn't automatically a predefined heaven or hell.
Okay.
Instead, the text suggests it depends fundamentally on who Michael Knowles really is,
Right.
on your essential nature and your relationship with that ultimate identity
Right.
with God.
That sounds like there are conditions involved. It's not a guaranteed blissful eternity for everyone.
The possibility of what the text delicately terms oblivion is raised.
Right.
If someone fundamentally rejects or displeases God
Right.
to such an extent that God cuts you off,
Right.
severing that inherent connection, then reunification becomes impossible.
Yeah.
Salvation in this context
Mhm.
is described as God actively pulling you back into himself.
Okay.
Conversely,
Yeah.
a persistent rejection of this fundamental reality of
Okay.
God
Yeah.
leads to God turning away,
Right.
solidifying that separation.
So it's about the ongoing nature of that fundamental connection we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
Even extending beyond physical life.
Right.
And the text offers a unique perspective on the concept of hell.
Yeah.
If an individual still clings to a desire for existence after death,
Right.
but has fundamentally rejected God and is thus separated,
Right.
they attempt to create their own reality.
Right.
If that individual has been bad or evil in life, the world they create will inevitably reflect that negativity.
Yeah.
A self-constructed, isolated realm of suffering cut off from the source of all goodness, which
Yeah.
is what we understand as hell.
Yeah.
So hell isn't necessarily a divine punishment inflicted from above, but more of a self-imposed exile,
Yes.
the consequence of one's own nature and choices in relation to the fundamental reality.
Yeah.
That's a profoundly different way of thinking about it.
It is.
Finally, the text addresses the existence of angels, demons, and the devil.
Okay.
These are often considered purely within the realm of religious faith.
Right.
But how does Langen CTMU approach these concepts?
Langen's affirmation is direct and unambiguous.
Okay.
Yes, God is real. Angels are real. Demons are real. Is the devil real? Oh, yes.
Okay.
His explanation hinges on the concept of God's perfect and complete nature,
Okay.
because God is defined by perfection and absolute being.
Yeah.
He cannot inherently contain or integrate imperfection or non-being.
Right.
Therefore, for God to be fully defined,
Yeah.
There must exist an antithesis, a counterpoint,
Right.
an anti-God or Satan.
So the existence of an opposite is almost a logical necessity for the definition of the positive.
Precisely.
Okay.
However, the text emphasizes that Satan is not a self-sufficient or coherent entity in his own right.
Oh, okay.
He derives his coherence and power through human beings,
Okay.
through what the CTMU terms secondary Tor.
Okay.
Think of it like this. Satan can't directly manifest power in the fundamental reality,
Right.
but he can exploit existing structures within our human world,
Okay.
corporations,
Right.
governments,
Mm-hmm.
social systems,
Yeah.
by influencing and acting through the individuals within them.
So when we see systemic evil in the world,
Right.
it's not necessarily Satan directly pulling the strings,
Exactly.
but rather his influence amplified through the flawed systems and individuals within our own creation.
That's the implication.
Right.
By exploiting human weaknesses and the structures we build,
Right.
negative forces can manifest in organized and pervasive ways.
Okay.
This understanding, according to the text,
Yeah.
ultimately reinforces the necessity of a perfect and unifying principle, God,
Yeah. Yeah.
at the center of reality,
Right.
encompassing the potential for both good and evil. Through this dynamic interplay between the primary source
Right.
and its secondary manifestations through human agency.
Okay, Michael, take a moment to process all of that.
Yeah.
We've journeyed from the fundamental nature of reality
It's what?
as both a display and a processor
Right.
to the essential role of God in this framework.
Yeah.
The active and participatory nature of consciousness, the genuine existence of free will,
Right.
the implications for what might await us after death
Yeah.
based on our fundamental nature,
Yeah.
and even a unique perspective on the reality and workings of good and evil.
Absolutely. And it all flows from this comprehensive and interconnected framework of Langen's CTMU.
Yeah.
It's a perspective that certainly challenges conventional understandings and offers just a vast landscape for contemplation.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with a powerful final thought for you, Michael.
Yeah.
Considering Langen's assertion that our consciousness actively participates in shaping reality,
Right.
how might that understanding shift your perspective on your everyday choices?
And their potential ripple effects, not just in your life here and now,
Yeah.
but perhaps even in the broader context of existence.
Yeah, that's a profound question.
Or given the intriguing idea that even seemingly inanimate objects
Right.
possess a fundamental level of generic consciousness,
Yeah.
how might that challenge your understanding of the universe and our place within it?
These are profound questions that really invite further exploration.
Yeah.
And we encourage you to delve deeper into these concepts and perhaps explore Christopher Langen's work in more detail.
Thank you for sharing such thought-provoking material with us, Michael.
Oh, you're welcome.
And for joining us on this deep dive until our next exploration. Keep those questions coming.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.